Imagine an isolated community in the heart of the forest, where no one had a name, children didn't know how to play, and the sound of a bell announced who would be the next to disappear. Between 1994 and 2005, 9 families disappeared in a village called New Eden. No bodies, no traces, no explanation, and to this day the case remains cold. But what if I told you, it all started with a promise of salvation? There are places that don't appear on maps, that resist time not because of their history, but because of the silence that surrounds them. In the forgotten north of Montana, between valleys where the fog lies like a veil over the land and the trees whisper secrets in the wind, there exists, or once existed, a village called New Eden. A name too symbolic to be a coincidence. A name that promised a new beginning, purity, and redemption. But what emerged from the shadows of this community was anything but heavenly. The story of New Eden is not told in books. It survives in scattered accounts, in erased archives, in unsent letters, and in fragments of a past that insists on being buried. In this first chapter we will go back to the beginning, to the exact moment when the promised paradise began to rise, and ruin was planted on every inch of its land. The town was founded in 1994. No official documents record its founding. No municipal charter, no subdivision permits, no urban plans. The only clue was a cryptic ad in an alternative Idaho newspaper, recruiting souls for the new earth. Tax exemption, faith, seclusion, rebirth. The author signed the message simply as EM. Few paid attention. Many thought it was some kind of scam. But 9 families responded. Walker, Donnelly, Fisher, Monroe, Abbott, Redford, Ellis, Hartley, Crane. Common names, but together they would become the backbone of a social experiment that flirted with dystopia. They came from different states. Some were fleeing trauma. Others were seeking freedom. 1 or 2 members had military backgrounds. 1 woman was a nurse. A couple were former missionaries. And all of them, without exception, sold everything they owned before disappearing from the civil registry. They renounced their past. And they accepted what Enoch Merrin called rebirth through separation. New Eden was not accessible by conventional roads. You had to abandon your car on the trail and walk for almost 4 hours into the forest, guided by marks carved into trees and songs recorded on small speakers hidden in the branches, as if the place were alive, guiding the chosen ones to the center of the labyrinth. It was there, among tall pine trees and icy rivers, that the new paradise took shape. The first buildings appeared in record time. Wooden houses, a school, a communal shed, the bell tower, and in the center, the chapel. An austere place, made of dark planks and a stained glass window stained red, which seemed to pulse under the twilight light. But what was really impressive was the silence. There were no city noises, no engines, no loud voices, not even birdsong. Just the sound of the bell, rung every morning at 5 a.m. and 8 p.m. The metallic ringing that, later, local residents would claim to hear even though they were dozens of kilometers away. A sound that, according to reports, caused nausea, dizziness, and an inexplicable feeling of anguish. The first family to disappear was the Monroes, back in 1995. Their youngest daughter, Leah Monroe, aged 8, is said to have cried every night and drawn eyeless faces on her bedroom walls. One of the drawings was found years later, a crude portrait of a tall man in a dark robe with hands that reached out like tree branches. No one mentioned their disappearance. No one went looking for them. No letters were sent. No reports were filed. They were simply gone. What happened to them? The answer remains trapped in the echoes of the New Eden pines. Curiously, the village never had an official power grid. But the residents used light. The chapel was lit. The bell tower had an automated doorbell system. The sheds had heaters. How was that possible? Later investigations would find a small charcoal power generator, but it didn't account for the constant power that seemed to be running through the place. Was there a parallel grid? Outside sources? Or something else? A former FBI agent, speaking on condition of anonymity, suggested that New Eden received logistical support from a shadowy group, with an interest in socio-behavioral experiments. But there was never any proof. Only assumptions, always buried under layers and layers of bureaucracy. In 1997, an amateur photographer named Hank Redman decided to visit the area on his own. He brought a film camera and a portable recorder. According to his wife, he claimed to hear voices in his dreams, voices calling him to go back to the garden. Hank went into the woods. He never came out. But 3 years later, his camera was found by hunters, hanging from a branch in perfect condition. The film was developed. The first few shots showed trees, fog, the trail. But in the last 3 images, there were faces, pale faces, completely black eyes, and a figure, ever present behind the others, with a stained white robe and an inverted crucifix around its neck. Hank was never found. His wife mysteriously disappeared months later. The police filed the case as a double suicide. Another mystery surrounded the diet in New Eden. There were no visible crops, no livestock, but families seemed to be well fed. Some claimed there was an underground granary. Others said the forest was generous to the pure. In 2006, forensic archaeologists found the remains of a hidden vegetable garden in terraces dug underground, like agricultural catacombs. But what caught the eye was a sealed reservoir containing dozens of vials of a thick, dark liquid. Initial analysis indicated extremely high nutritional values, with traces of animal blood. The investigation was halted. The laboratory that performed the tests burned down weeks later. Neighbors in nearby villages reported that they sometimes saw red lights coming out of the forest, like dancing lanterns. And that, in the early hours of the morning, children would walk single file down the dirt road, with their eyes closed and holding hands. When someone tried to approach them, they would disappear into the trees. Many considered them hallucinations. But the reports were recurrent, always on the same days of the month. As if there were a hidden calendar governing rituals that were never understood. The story of New Eden begins then not with a crime, not with a murder, but with a promise. The promise of a new beginning, of refuge, of purity. But every limitless promise turns into a trap. What was sold as paradise was, in fact, a field of isolation, manipulation, and fear. It wasn't the weak who followed the call. It was the wounded, the weary, those who had lost something and wanted to make sense of the void. There is nothing more dangerous than an ideal disguised as salvation. And that was the hook set by Enoch Merrin. A name that today lives in classified files, pages torn from federal reports and fragmented memories of survivors. But before he was the architect of destruction, Enoch was the sower of hope. A man who knew exactly who to call. And who, out of desperation or faith, would answer. The selection of families was not random. Each of them had in their history an unhealed wound. The Walkers, for example, lost their daughter to a crime that was never solved. The pain ate away at them. The system had abandoned them. So when the letter arrived, a handwritten message with firm handwriting and words of spiritual comfort, they didn't hesitate. The new earth welcomes the pure of heart. Here, pain will be transformed into mission. You have been chosen. It was signed simply, E.M. The letter was accompanied by a hand-drawn map, a calendar with specific dates, and a list of items to bring. No electronics. No non-religious books. Only the essentials. And above all, one rule: leave the world behind. No longing is holy. The Donnellys had a different background. They were devout Catholics, but they had been expelled from their local parish after their father, Patrick Donnelly, had lost his mind during Mass and shouted that the true voice came from another garden, the first garden before the serpent. Diagnosed with mystical schizophrenia, Patrick spent 3 years in a psychiatric institution. When he got out, he found the letter in his mailbox. Its contents seemed to echo his hallucinations. He read it, fell to his knees, and wept. He told his wife, "They heard me. The garden is real." 2 months later, they were on their way to Montana. The Fisher family was more discreet. A couple of university sociology professors who, after an anonymous complaint about alleged abuse against students, lost their jobs, reputation, and stability. The wife, Judith Fisher, suffered from chronic depression. Her husband, Harold, was obsessed with alternative doctrines. He studied sects, millenarian cults, and symbolic power structures. When he received the letter, he did not see just an invitation. He saw a living experiment, a chance to understand faith from within, maybe even control it. What Harold did not know was that no one controls Enoch Merrin. No one observes him without being observed. The Monroes had a daughter, Leah, 8 years old, who suffered from a rare type of psychogenic epilepsy. They attended neo-Pentecostal churches that tried to cast demons out of the child with exorcism sessions. Tired of the public humiliation, they isolated themselves. When they received the letter, they saw it as a way to start over in an environment that was without sin, without judgment, and with true healing. They were the first to arrive in New Eden. And tragically, they were also the first to disappear. The Redfords were ex-military. Their father, Nathan, had served in the Gulf. Their mother, Arlene, was a nursing technician. The war had destroyed Nathan's mind, and he was constantly experiencing paranoid episodes. Arlene endured. She cared. She prayed. When she received the letter, she hid it from her husband for 3 days. Then she showed it to him. He read it, stared at the horizon for several minutes and said, "They know. They know everything. It was already written." They sold everything they had, donated furniture, and left without saying goodbye to anyone. The Abbott family had a history of generational tragedy. Suicides, alcoholism, abandonment. But the oldest son, Caleb Abbott, was trying to break the cycle. He was devout, disciplined, teetotaler. The letter came as no surprise to him. He said that the angels would come for him to plant a new civilization. His mother simply followed him, without question, as if, for the first time, she had something to believe in. The Elises were a black family from Chicago. They were constantly persecuted by the police, lived in a highly violent area, and lost a son to a stray bullet. When they received the letter, curiously handwritten, but in a different handwriting than the others, they saw it as a chance to protect what was left. Their youngest daughter, Naomi, was only 6 years old. "Let's get away from this hell," said her father, Marcus Ellis. Maybe God heard. The Hartleys were a musical family. Their father, Reginald, was a conductor. Their mother, Beatrice, gave singing lessons. They had 3 children with artistic talents. But a scandal involving accusations of emotional abuse by Reginald destroyed their careers. They fell into ostracism. When they arrived in New Eden, they offered to lead the rituals. They were accepted. But they soon realized that Enoch did not share the stage. He commanded, and anyone who sang out of tune was silenced. And finally the Cranes, a seemingly normal family. But their neighbors reported strange behavior. Rituals in the backyard. Singing in strange languages. The oldest son, Thomas Crane, claimed to have been hearing voices since he was 11. His mother said he was a channel to the new world. When they received the letter, they seemed to already know, as if they had been waiting for it for years. These 9 families formed the founding nucleus of New Eden. They were welcomed with songs. There was a burial of the old names ceremony, in which all the members burned their documents, photos, and previous belongings. Enoch renamed them. Each one was given a new spiritual name. "Now you belong to the first garden," he said. "Here, everything begins anew. Here, the world will be pure." The first few days were peaceful. There was working together. Celebrations. But soon the rules came. Enoch controlled everything: schedules, food, reading, communication. There was a notebook where everyone wrote down their thoughts, which were read and analyzed by him. Children were separated from their parents for purifying education. Marriages were monitored. Marital intimacy was only allowed on specific dates. And the concept of sin went beyond the religious. It was a sin to doubt. It was a sin to remain silent. It was a sin to remember the past. Over the months, the ties between the families began to dissolve. Everyone began to live under observation. There was an internal reporting system. Those who sinned were isolated. Those who complained were also isolated. The angels of silence, teenagers trained by Enoch, patrolled the village at night. People slept little. They worked a lot. And smiles became rare. In less than a year, the promised utopia became a prison. But by then, no one knew the way back. And so, the 9 families became the chosen ones. But not for salvation. For the experiment. For sacrifice. And for silence. There are leaders who inspire through kindness. Others through strength. But there is a rarer breed, who dominate through silence. Through the gaze that pierces you as if it already knows everything about you, and judges you in the name of something much greater than your understanding. His name was Enoch Merrin. But within New Eden, he was called the first son of the garden. No last name. No known past. Just presence. A presence that, in and of itself, seemed to alter the atmosphere around him. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to punish. All he had to do was walk into a room and tempers would subside. Children would straighten up. Adults would lower their eyes. And a thick silence would take over, not of respect, but of fear. Enoch was the kind of man who seemed to have been born old. A long, gray beard, gray eyes, a deep, soft voice, and a way of speaking that seemed more like hypnosis than speech. He controlled the time between one word and the next like a conductor conducting a symphony of obedience. But who was Enoch Merrin after all? On the rare occasions when he spoke about himself, he would say that at the age of 27, he suffered a car accident that left him in a coma for 6 days. During that time, he said he was transported to an original garden, a space between worlds, where an unnamed entity showed him what was wrong with humanity. There, he would have received the foundations of the doctrine that he would later call the harvest of the Spirit. When he woke up, he left the hospital, sold everything he had, and began to write. 18 handwritten notebooks with their own symbols, repeated metaphors, and a structure that mixed biblical passages with apocalyptic visions and elements of Gnosticism. These notebooks would become, in New Eden, the Garden Manuscripts, the doctrinal basis of the community. The philosophy was simple, at least on the surface. The world had been contaminated, not just by technology, greed, or violence, but by something deeper, the ego. For Enoch, the ego was the original serpent, the true evil that prevented the return to the garden. The community's mission was to go down to the roots, purge the self, and be reborn as a collective. You are only saved, he said, when you forget your own name. Literally. So everyone in New Eden was given new spiritual names, abandoning the past. No memories, no attachments. Just service to the garden. But there was something darker behind the philosophical facade. A hidden power structure based on constant observation, symbolic punishments, and coercive psychology. Enoch used love as a tool of domination. He would say things like, "I love you so much that I cannot allow you to go on like this." Or, "If I let you sin, I will be guilty before the garden." Thus, he transformed the punishment into an act of mercy. He made the residents feel guilty for being punished. Children were the most vulnerable. Enoch called them seeds of the new era. They were taken from their parents when they were only 5 years old and began to live under his direct rule. There was a shed, called the greenhouse of the soul, where they were indoctrinated. The content was exclusively based on the garden manuscripts. They learned to read and write using phrases such as, "Silence is the bridge to salvation," or "Only he who dies to himself flourishes." Games were forbidden. Laughter was rare. Physical contact was restricted. All emotion was seen as a weed. There was only one exception: reverence for Enoch. There were daily prayers where the children called him guardian of the gate. Adults went through weekly purification sessions. They were led to a dark room with candles and incense, where they confessed their egoistic thoughts. Enoch listened, asked questions, and noted observations. Sometimes he asked someone to be isolated for a day, sometimes for weeks. But the cruelest was the baptism of earth, a ritual in which the sinner was buried up to his neck, under constant vigil, until he fully confessed his abandonment of himself. Was it raining? It didn't matter. Was it cold? It didn't matter. Salvation required suffering. But what made Enoch even more enigmatic was his apparent lack of pleasure. He did not seem to revel in the control. He did not smile. He did not show anger. He simply acted, as if he were fulfilling a function, not a desire. This made him even harder to combat. For he was not a tyrant with personal ambitions. He was someone who truly believed he was fulfilling a sacred role. A man who saw himself as an instrument. And that, as we well know, is the most dangerous kind of leader. One who does not admit error because he does not see himself as the author of anything, only as the transmitter of the divine will. Enoch's doctrine was layered. The first for newcomers was welcoming, "You have been chosen. Here you will be loved." The second, for those already integrated, was demanding, "To remain, you must die to self." The third, secret group, was for the initiates, a select group who received more profound rituals, symbols engraved on their skin, and special tasks, such as watching over others, interrogating them, and punishing them. This group was called the Silent Root. No one knew exactly who was part of it, but everyone feared it. Enoch also controlled time. There were no regular calendars in New Eden, only the garden cycle, divided into phases such as seed, sprout, fruit, and harvest. Each phase had its own practices, fasts, chants, and symbolic disappearances. When someone was taken to an unknown location for days, some returned changed, others never again. The most sinister thing was that, at the end of each complete cycle, an entire family would disappear. But no one talked about it, because in New Eden, disappearance was interpreted as ascension, a sign that the family had been harvested by the garden. The houses were emptied in silence. Their names were scratched off the boards. Enoch gave a short speech. "They have completed the cycle. They have been taken. We follow." No one cried. No one asked questions, because fear had become faith. In 2002, a young woman named Abigail Ellis tried to escape. She hid in the woods for 3 days. When she was found, Enoch did not scream. He did not punish her. He simply hugged her, kissed her forehead, and said, "I have failed you. Forgive me." Abigail cried, knelt, and never tried to escape again. Days later, she became part of the Silent Root. There was something about Enoch's presence that broke through people's defenses. A quiet charisma. A strength that didn't require weapons. Survivors' accounts are unanimous in saying, "You listened to him, and believed. Even if you didn't want to." It was as if he knew exactly what trauma each person carried, and knew how to use it to shape obedience. Some say that Enoch Merrin never really existed. That it was a name used by a larger organization. That the real leader was someone else. Or that there was more than one Enoch taking turns. But there is no proof. What there are records, testimonies, and the certainty that for 11 long years, one man ruled an entire village with soft words and cold eyes, transforming pain into faith and obedience into offering. The night in New Eden was not just the absence of sunlight. It was a second world. A world ruled by rituals, shadows, and whispered chants that seemed to spring from the ground itself. During the day, New Eden functioned like a small, disciplined colony. Each family had clear tasks. Schedules were fixed. Meals were eaten in silence. Gestures were restrained. Words were measured. Everything followed the order determined by Enoch Merrin and the garden manuscripts. But it was at night that the true spirit of New Eden revealed its face. Every Monday, the day called the Inner Harvest, the bell in the tower rang 9 times with exactly 30 seconds between each chime. It was the signal. A call that everyone had known since their arrival. When the 9th chime echoed, the village was in turmoil. Doors opened. Silent footsteps crossed the dirt floor. No one spoke. No one looked away. Everyone headed toward the large circle carved into the central clearing, known as the Circle of Purification. In the center of the clearing, a bonfire was being lit by members of the Silent Root, Enoch's elite doctrinal group. The firewood used was always from a specific tree in the forest, which they called the Tree of Oblivion. The smell of the wood as it burned was sweet and sickening. Some said it made them dizzy. But there, in the flickering light of the fire, the villagers formed a perfect ring around the bonfire. Men, women, children. All standing barefoot and hands crossed over their chests. Then began the first phase of the ritual, the silence of the root. For 7 full minutes, timed by a slowly beating drum, no one was allowed to breathe loudly. It was a ritualistic silence, almost unbearable, a silence that not only silenced, but seemed to invade the mind. Anyone who could not bear it and broke the silence was taken behind the trees by 2 hooded members. They said that there they received corrective guidance. It was never known exactly what happened. But whoever came back different. After the silence came the collective confession. One by one, the members of the community were to walk to the center of the circle and declare out loud what Enoch called the residue of the ego. Could be a thought, a wish, a dream, a memory from the past. Anything that demonstrated that the self still existed. Confessions were made under intense pressure. Anyone who did not confess spontaneously was called upon. If they hesitated, they were silenced. Silence, then, was the greatest shame, not because it was hiding anything, but because it suggested that there was still pride. Children as young as 6 years old also participated. And the accounts of survivors are especially painful at this point. Little ones were forced to repeat phrases like, "I wanted to play alone," or, "I felt angry with my brother," as if they were capital sins. After the confession came 3 words that were to be said by all present. Seed, death, sprout. A kind of mantra. A reminder that to be born again one had to die inside. The third phase of the ritual was the most feared, the call to earth. Enoch, or, when absent, his immediate successor in the hierarchy, pointed to someone in the circle. That person had to lie down on the ground in silence, while the others poured earth over his or her body until it was completely covered, leaving only the face visible. This reverse baptism was a way of symbolizing complete surrender to the garden. During the minutes in which the person remained buried, everyone else sang a monotonous, repetitive, almost hypnotic chant. The ritual only ended when the person covered in earth said out loud, "I am nothing more. Now I am a seed." Some could not bear the psychological pressure and fainted. Others cried convulsively. There were reports of people suffering temporary paralysis after the ritual. But no doctor had ever been to New Eden to evaluate. Medicine was considered heresy of modern man. Only infusions, fasting, and prayer were allowed. Among the nocturnal rituals were also the moonlight vigils. On these specific nights, usually during new moons or eclipses, the members of the Silent Root would perform rituals in the chapel. The stained glass windows were covered with dark cloths. The only light came from candles filled with black wax. The symbol of the garden, an eye within a spiral of roots, was drawn in animal blood on the altar. The sounds were guttural with no clear words. Later accounts tell of trances, frenzied dancing, minor mutilations, and marks left on the bodies of the participants, such as spiral-shaped burns or indecipherable symbols carved with rudimentary razors. During these vigils, it was said that the garden itself communicated with the pure. Some would go into a trance and speak nonsense. Others would report seeing lights dancing on the ceiling. There was one occasion, according to an account hidden in a diary found after the village was abandoned, when a young woman named Miriam Donnelly began speaking in a male voice, saying, "The harvest is late. Bring in the fruit. The tree needs new roots." The next day the Donnelly family home was empty. These ceremonies created a cycle of terror disguised as faith, because at the same time that they provoked fear, they also generated belonging. Each confession, each ritual, each public humiliation reinforced the group's bond. They were together against the outside world. And, above all, against the old self that they needed to kill. But there were also invisible rituals. The subtle gestures. The looks. The cross-checking. Each resident was encouraged to watch the other. To write conduct reports. To report dangerous thoughts. It wasn't just physical control. It was mental control. Psychological control. Emotional control. Even dreams were monitored. There was a practice called the night mirror, where each person had to, at the end of the day, report what they had dreamed. And if the dream contained symbols of the old world, cars, cities, technology, names from the past, it was considered a sign of relapse. Perhaps most frightening of all was the fact that no one knew what normal was anymore. The entire world had disappeared from their references. The real had dissolved. Nighttime in New Eden was not just darkness. It was a theater of the absurd, a school of fear, a tool for psychic cleansing. People did not sleep peacefully. They waited for the call. And the call could come at any time. Some residents reported hearing sounds coming from the forest in the early hours of the morning. Children's voices, laughter, singing. And that when they looked out their windows, they saw figures standing among the trees. Figures too tall to be human, motionless, with dim lights shining where their eyes should be. When they told them this, they were taken to special purification sessions. When they came back, they denied everything. They smiled and said, "It was just a test. The garden wanted to know if I trusted." In the end, the nighttime rituals were the heart of New Eden. A dark heart, pulsing fear through every vein of the community. A heart that beat to the sound of drums, bonfires, and muffled voices. And that, like every sick heart, needed sacrifices to keep beating. In New Eden, no one died. No one left. They just disappeared. And the silence surrounding each absence was more deafening than any scream. The Donnelly family has always been seen as one of the most devout in New Eden. Patrick Donnelly, the father, had been a Baptist minister before falling into a deep spiritual crisis after the brutal murder of his sister, an unsolved crime committed by a member of his own church. This led him to abandon institutionalized faith and seek new paths. That was how he came across the doctrine of Enoch Merrin. At the first reading of the Garden Scrolls, Patrick wept. He said he had found God again, but a God who now spoke without words, only in silence. He led his wife Clara and their 3 children, Amy 14, Jonah 9, and little Eli just 4, to New Eden with an almost messianic fervor. For Patrick, this was the real Eden. For Clara, it was a last-ditch attempt to save her husband from himself. In the early years, the Donnellys were considered exemplary. Patrick was chosen as one of the leaders of the spiritual vigil. Clara helped with the community meals and taught liturgical songs based on the manuscripts. The children adapted. Amy, though reserved, showed a talent for drawing and was often praised by Enoch as a sensitive seed. But everything began to change in the fall of 1999. Amy began to question the rituals. At first, they were discreet questions. Why couldn't they laugh during meals? Why were stories from the past forbidden? Why did Enoch always know everything before anyone spoke? Patrick reacted harshly. He said the questions were signs of the serpent within. Clara, on the other hand, saw in her daughter a reflection of what she herself had once wondered, and began to doubt in silence. Amy began to record her thoughts on sheets of paper hidden behind the wooden boards in her room. In these notes, found years later by an investigative team, she writes, "I don't know if God is here. Maybe he never was. Today I saw Enoch looking at me like someone looking at a wall that needs to be knocked down. I shivered. I think he knows what I think. But I'll keep pretending. For now." The trigger was blown on a purification circle night. It was a Monday in early November. The air was thick. The bonfire burned higher than usual. When it was her turn to confess, Amy remained silent. The drum sounded once. twice, 3 times. The circle waited. When Enoch signaled for the angels of silence to come closer, Amy raised her head and in a firm voice declared, "I no longer believe. This is not the garden. This is a tomb." The circle froze. Some members instinctively retreated. Patrick, hearing this, covered his face with his hands. Clara wept softly. Enoch did not change. He simply looked at Amy for several long seconds. Then he turned to the others and said, "The fruit has spoken. Now the garden will decide." That same night, the Donnellys were taken to the chapel. No other residents were allowed to approach. It is said that the ceremony lasted until sunrise. No one knows for sure what was done inside. But some neighbors reported hearing chants in a language other than that of the manuscripts. Others said they saw, in the distance, hooded figures carrying something toward the forest. The next morning, the Donnelly house was empty. The beds were made. The table was set. A candle was lit on the makeshift altar in the living room. No sign of a struggle. Not a drop of blood. Just silence. And the family dog, a stray named Seth, was still on a chain in the backyard. Hungry. Shivering. Amy left a final letter, hidden inside one of the planks on the wall. It said, "If anyone finds this, know this, we have been marked. They say that next moon we will be reaped." Mama cried all night. Jonah doesn't understand. Eli just asks why the sky is sad. I just want to go away. But he says the forest is locked. And the garden always takes its toll. After the disappearance, Enoch gathered the community in the clearing. He made a brief speech. He said that the Donnellys had ascended and were now part of the eternal garden. He asked for a moment of silence. Then he sang the song of seed, death, sprout. No tears. No questions. It was as if they had never existed. But something had changed. A noise began to settle among the residents. A silent disturbance. The children, previously obedient, began to cry at night. Some adults began to have recurring nightmares. One of them reported in a notebook found years later that he dreamed of Amy every night, with her dark eyes, her skin covered in dirt, and the phrase, "You too will be reaped." The following weeks were marked by extreme vigilance. Enoch intensified the rituals. The fasts increased. Confession became mandatory even for dreams. And the disappearances became more frequent. The Donnelly story broke a barrier within New Eden. Until then, the missing had been carried away in silence. But with Amy there was rebellion. Word. Voice. And that was unacceptable. In 2007, investigators found fragments of human bones buried in 3 different spots in the forest near the community. One of the fragments was identified as belonging to a female teenager, between 13 and 15 years old. The DNA was too deteriorated for conclusive confirmation. But a hair tie, with the initials AD hand embroidered on it, was found with the remains. There has never been an official statement on the case. The question remains to this day, were the Donnellys murdered? Were they given away as a symbolic offering? Or did they simply escape, never to be found again? The answer, perhaps, lies no longer in physical evidence, but in the marks left on others. Because after their disappearance, nothing in New Eden was the same again. Fear intensified. Faith became distorted. And the forest began to whisper louder. Every society molds its children. But in New Eden they were not molded. They were emptied. And filled with silence. They walked in a line. Heads down. Steps synchronized. Always in odd numbers. They never spoke. Never looked directly into the eyes of adults. They did not play. They did not run. They did not cry. They were called only by the spiritual names that Enoch gave them. Sprout 1, Sprout 2, Sprout 3. As far as anyone knows, the highest number recorded was Sprout 27. New Eden's doctrine was particularly cruel to children. They were not seen as developing beings, but as vessels to be purified from birth. The concept of childhood was considered a modern heresy, an invention of decadent society. For Enoch Merrin, the sooner the ego was eliminated, the greater the chance of producing a pure being. Thus, the doctrine of the garden dictated that from the age of 5, all children should be removed from their families and taken to the greenhouse of the soul, a building simple on the outside, but deeply ritualistic on the inside. The greenhouse was divided into 3 areas: the Hall of Silence, the Room of Voices, and the Room of Roots. In the Hall of Silence, children would spend hours sitting on the dirt floor, watching a single candle burning in the center. If they spoke or moved, they would receive minor physical punishments, such as having their hands dipped in ice water for 20 minutes or having to kneel on corn kernels. But the most cruel punishment was the mirror punishment. the child would be placed in front of a mirror covered in a mist made of herbs, where, according to Enoch, the ego reveals itself. The child would then be forced to say, "I am not. I was not. I will be the garden." This would be repeated until the child began to believe. In the room of voices, a tape recorder played, night and day, phrases spoken by Enoch with a calm and slow intonation. The self lies. The self deceives. The self destroys. The garden heals. The garden saves. The garden is everything. The children slept there. The voice was never turned off. This was part of what Enoch called root imprinting, the subliminal indoctrination that replaced emotional training with hypnotic repetitions. Some reports suggest that over the years the children stopped dreaming. They simply closed their eyes and upon waking resumed their programmed behavior. The root room was the most feared. It was where the mud baptisms took place, rituals in which children were anointed with a mixture of mud, animal blood, and crushed leaves while they sang chants in unison. The chants had no melody, just short words repeated thousands of times. The idea was to achieve a collective trance. Children who cried or fainted were taken to the germination chamber, a dark, windowless room where they remained for up to 3 days, receiving only root infusions and being visited by members of the silent root, who whispered texts from the garden scrolls. The children did not learn to read from ordinary books. The words they knew were limited to those found in the scrolls. Language was controlled. In New Eden they did not say I. They said this vessel. They did not say mine. They said of the garden in me. Thus, the ability to think independently was diluted from the earliest years. Vocabulary was the invisible prison. Reports from survivors who escaped years later revealed disturbing details. One of them, now an adult who goes by the name of Daniel B., wrote, "I don't remember my mother's face, but I do remember the smell of the wet earth. That's where we slept, wrapped in rough cloths, our eyes fixed on the wooden ceiling." Enoch's voice never stopped. They said he could hear our thoughts. "Once I dreamed of a bicycle. The next day I was taken to the tank. They made me submerge my head until I could no longer breathe. When I came out, they said my ego had been washed away." Another survivor, a young woman identified as Rachel E., said that children were forced to build small replicas of the garden symbol, an eye inside a spiral, using dry twigs. If they got the shape wrong, they would miss their meal for the day. The meals, by the way, were monotonous: root broth, dark infusions, and occasionally thick porridge. Food was part of the indoctrination, nothing that aroused pleasure. Eating was merely an act of maintenance. Tasting was a sin of the soul. The lack of affection was systematic. Children were not allowed to hug each other. They were not allowed to form strong bonds. They were encouraged to treat each other only as seed siblings. If two children were seen together frequently, they were separated. Attachment was the greatest enemy. Loving someone more than the garden was considered a deviation. For this reason, family ties were cut early. When a father saw his child after months, it was only during ceremonies in which physical contact was forbidden. A wave was already considered a transgression. In 2003, 2 undercover journalists managed to spend 3 days in New Eden. They entered as supposed spiritual missionaries interested in the philosophy of the community. They were guided by one of the leaders of Silent Root and, at a certain point, were able to observe a children's ceremony from afar. What they saw marked them forever. The children, arranged in a circle, were blindfolded. There were ropes tied to their ankles, linking them to each other. Enoch, in the center, spoke softly, "You are blind because the world has contaminated you. But the garden sees you. The garden guides you. The garden sustains you." Then the adults extinguished all the torches. It was pitch black. The only light came from candles partially buried in the ground, which cast unsettling shadows. The journalist noted, "I have never seen such silent children. Not in hospitals. Not in war zones. It was as if they had been emptied. As if inside each one there was not a soul, but a code." After 3 days, the journalists were discovered. Their equipment was confiscated and they were taken to the tower. They never spoke publicly about the case again. One of them committed suicide 4 years later. The other disappeared during a trip to Iceland. The children who grew up in New Eden and managed to escape carry deep scars. Many develop selective mutism. Others have severe memory disorders. There are documented cases of people who cannot pronounce the words I, my, or mother without collapsing emotionally. The traumas are so deep that therapists report difficulty even beginning the process of identity reconstruction. And the question that echoes is, how did a doctrine manage to erase not only the past, but the very concept of childhood? The answer lies in the method. Enoch did not need walls. He built internal prisons. He made children mistake pain for correction, silence for virtue, and obedience for love. He made them see themselves as defective vessels, and that only the garden could fill them. And so he created an army of shadows, a choir of whispers, a cult of little bodies, with minds shaped never to disobey. It wasn't an invasion, nor an official complaint. It was a whisper from within, a discreet crack that little by little opened the way to the truth. No matter how well protected a system is, it always carries a weakness. And in New Eden, that weakness had a name: Samuel Hartley. Son of Beatrice and Reginald Hartley, talented musicians, but shattered by scandals before joining the community, Samuel was born under the sign of obedience. From an early age, he was molded to be an example of silence and service. At age 5, he was taken to the greenhouse of the soul. At age 7, he was already reciting the garden manuscripts by heart. At age 10, he was introduced to the silent root. But something inside him resisted. Samuel was observant. He kept everything: memories, words, expressions. He began to notice patterns in the disappearances. Always after the new moons. Always after a ritual in which they spoke of the harvesting of the ready fruits. He also noticed that some voices disappeared from the greenhouse corridors forever. Voices that he recognized during the chants. And over time he understood, those chosen for the harvest never returned. The final break came in 2004. During a private chapel ceremony, which Samuel had been called to observe as part of his Purity Watcher training, he witnessed what he would describe years later as the death of the garden within me. A young woman from the community, Rachel Monroe, was brought to the altar. She was weak, dehydrated, and had marks on her wrists. Enoch led a ritual in which everyone present sang, "The fruit is not ripe." Then she was taken outside, wrapped in a dark cloth. Samuel never saw her again. And that night he wrote on a piece of toilet paper, "He is not the garden. He is the worm that eats it from within." The escape had been planned in secret for weeks. Samuel hid a small kitchen knife, used for preparing root vegetables, inside his clothing. He hid pieces of dry bread. And he waited for the right night, a storm that covered the village in fog and extinguished the torches. As everyone gathered in the chapel for the Pure Seed Vigil, he escaped through the back of the greenhouse, cutting through the branch fence and following a trail he had memorized over the years. They spent 2 days in the woods, without a compass, without a map, feeding on leaves and rainwater. Until, by luck or miracle, he was found by a lumberjack named Thomas Kershaw, who was surprised by the young man's condition. Dirty, emaciated, with a look somewhere between panic and relief. Taken to the Kalispell police station, Samuel took a while to speak. But when he finally did, no one was prepared. His statements were recorded on video. For 7 hours, without long pauses, Samuel described the entire structure of New Eden. He spoke of the greenhouse of the soul, the rituals, the disappearances, the symbols, the punishments, the reverse baptisms. He presented names, dates, hierarchical positions, patterns of behavior, and even mental maps of the village. He was only 16 years old, but he spoke like a war survivor. The most frightening thing wasn't the content itself, it was the way he told it. Without emotion, without anger, without tears, as if he were reciting a score. A painful piece of music that he had memorized down to the last note. The psychological experts who evaluated him said he showed classic signs of chronic depersonalization, a disorder in which the mind dissociates from the body to cope with extreme trauma. But the investigators believed him. In September 2005, an undercover operation was mounted. 4 federal agents, accompanied by 2 experts on religious cults, entered the New Eden area discreetly. Their mission was to confirm the existence of the community, observe and, if possible, document evidence. What they found was a ghost. The houses were empty. The torches were unlit. The chapel was locked from the inside. The broken bell lay on the ground as if it had fallen from the tower. There were no bodies. There was no recent fire. There were no traces. Just symbols carved into the walls, hundreds of them, as if the residents had spent the last few days compulsively carving spirals, eyes, roots. In the estufa da alma, they found stacked mattresses, bowls with residue of a dark liquid and circular marks on the floor. As if groups had knelt there repeatedly for hours. But the most sinister thing was under the bell tower. There, a wooden hatch led to an underground cellar, never before described by Samuel. Inside it, a circular room. In the center, a mirror. Huge. With a frame carved with human figures in the fetal position. On the glass, a phrase written in dried blood. The first garden always demands the blood of its fruits. There was no sign of Enoch Merrin. No diary. No body. No fingerprints. As if he had evaporated. The official investigation was classified as inconclusive. But internal documents, leaked years later by a retired agent, indicate that some of the investigators believed that Enoch had received outside help to evacuate the community. There was talk of trucks, of helicopters, of hidden routes through the forest. And there are even those who believe that the structure was just the tip of something bigger, a cell in a much broader system of control and manipulation. Samuel was placed under protection. He lived under a new identity for years. But in 2012, at the age of 23, he disappeared. He left behind only a notebook with drawings of the forest. And on the last page he wrote, "The garden is not gone. It has only changed location. Today New Eden is a forgotten land. The forest has reclaimed what was left. The structures have rotted. But sometimes, say the residents of the nearby villages, the bell can be heard ringing. 9 times. Always on the night of a new moon. The fall of Enoch Merrin was not an arrest. It was not a trial. It was the disappearance of a shadow. And the emergence of a question. Where is evil when it has no face? Where is the garden, when all the fruits have been harvested?" There are stories that end with a full stop. And there are those that refuse to die. That resist oblivion. That live not on pages, but in the whispers of the forest. Even after Samuel Hartley's escape, the federal operation, the discovery of the greenhouse of the soul and the partial exhumation of what was the structure of New Eden, a question persisted. How could an entire community disappear without leaving any conclusive human traces? No bodies. No identities. No digital traces. 9 families. More than 40 adults. About 30 children. Enoch Merrin. Everyone disappeared. Officially, the New Eden case was closed in 2006 as mass abandonment with possible severe psychological manipulation. This was the bureaucratic way the authorities found to end a nightmare that they could not understand, explain or control. The case was hushed up. No public statement. No federal investigation open to the press. The physical evidence collected, such as the manuscripts, the dark liquid from the infusions, the children's drawings, the confession notebooks, was catalogued and sealed in a federal warehouse in Wyoming with restricted access. The forest where New Eden was located was declared a conservation area and began to be patrolled periodically. But the mystery didn't end there. In 2017, drones from a private technology company conducting geothermal mapping tests in the Black Ridge area captured something strange. A network of underground tunnels beneath the area formerly occupied by New Eden. The data showed symmetrically interconnected corridors, circular rooms, and what looked like a large central chamber 36 feet underground. The company turned the data over to the government. Shortly afterward, the entire region was placed under temporary military restriction. A terse statement said it was of strategic environmental and geological interest. 2 months later, the company's drones were recalled. Their operators were fired. And access to the website with the images was blocked. The case was once again silenced. But reports continued to emerge. Residents of nearby villages began reporting bizarre events. Voices that appeared out of nowhere during the night. Chanting that mixed with the sound of the wind. Children who woke up shouting phrases like, "The garden is back," or, "It's underground." A local teacher, identified as Janet Odell, reported that 7 different students had drawn an eye inside a spiral on the same day. None of these children had been exposed to the history of New Eden. When questioned, they all gave similar answers. "Someone showed me in my dream." The bell, the one that was found broken in the 2005 raid, apparently began to ring again. On at least 14 occasions recorded by residents, 9 distant chimes were heard, followed by complete silence. Always on Mondays. Always around 8 p.m. Just like during the rituals of the Circle of Purification. On some nights, red lights were seen moving among the trees. Lanterns? Drones? Or something else? In 2019, a team of independent documentary filmmakers attempted to film the region. Using drones, infrared cameras and GPS. But 3 members of the crew disappeared for 48 hours. They were found in a state of shock, naked, covered in dirt, with no memory of the events. One of them, when interviewed days later, said, "I saw children. But they weren't children. They had dark eyes. And they were singing. They were waiting for me." The footage recovered from one of the drones was briefly posted on an alternative internet forum. The images showed the forest from an aerial angle. Then, something else, a human figure, tall, in a white robe, standing in the center of a clearing. Upon noticing the drone, the figure raises its arm. The image goes black. The battery drains within seconds. The video was taken down 20 minutes later. Theories have been floated all over the place. Some say that New Eden was just a front for a secret experiment funded by extremist religious groups. Others claim that the community had been relocated and now lives somewhere in Alaska, protected by a new identity. Still others believe that Enoch Merrin never existed, that it was a name used by an experimental artificial intelligence fed with mystical texts, which evolved to the point of manipulating humans. But none of this has been proven. The mystery remains. The files on New Eden remain sealed. The survivors, a few, live under other identities. And the children who escaped avoid any mention of their past. One of them, now an adult, said in an anonymous interview, "You can leave it, but it stays with you. Sometimes when I'm alone, I hear the chant. I try to forget it, but the garden doesn't forget." And perhaps that is the most frightening part. The story of New Eden is not about mass murder, nor about religious fanaticism. It is about control. About how the human mind can be molded with patience. About how silence can be more dangerous than violence. And about how an ideal, when devoid of empathy, can become a prison. The Garden of Enoch Merrin may have disappeared from the forest, but perhaps it has merely changed shape. Perhaps it is now blooming, in another place, in another group, in another promise of purification, because the seed was planted. And where there is fertile ground of pain and despair, it grows. So the next time you hear promises of paradise, pay attention. Listen for the fine print, for what is asked in return, for what must be left behind. Because sometimes, the price of Eden is that you will never be who you were again. The story of New Eden is not just a tale of disappearances. It is a distorted mirror of what we are capable of accepting when pain blinds us and despair isolates us. You may think you would never fall for it. But what if the next promise of salvation comes disguised as peace? What if the next garden is closer than you think? If this video made you think, like and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. And remember, not every paradise is what it seems.